Welcome to Virtual Sentiments. I'm your host, Kristen Collins. On today's episode, I talk to Dr. Eileen Hunt, professor of political science at University of Notre Dame. She is a political theorist whose scholarly interests cover modern political thought, the ethics of technology, and philosophy and literature. This is our second episode with Eileen. Back in our very first season, we talked to her about her book, Artificial Life After Frankenstein. Today, we'll be discussing her latest book, The First Last Man, Mary Shelley and the Post-Apocalyptic Imagination. We recorded this episode in October of 2024, and we are now sharing it with you in March 2025, which marks the 5-year anniversary of the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the reasons I really wanted to do this episode is that I've gotten the sense that even though the pandemic was not that long ago, and we continue to live with the effects of COVID-19, that it was such a tragic and difficult episode in our lives has led many people to ignore just how horrible the disease was in its first year, how necessary the adjustments to life, and how difficult those personal and political decisions were during those years. The way that we live now is thanks to the development and implementation of vaccines made possible only through the efforts of scientists and private actors, and also public government actors as well. This episode will not review the details of that recent history. Rather, talking to Eileen situates our recent experiences in a historical perspective by teaching us about Mary Shelley's 1826 novel, The Last Man, the first post-apocalyptic pandemic novel. I have not read this novel, and you don't have to have read it either to enjoy this episode. I do want to bracket this conversation with a couple comments on some of the darker themes that we'll be discussing here. You should know that this novel was born out of Mary Shelley's deeply tragic personal life. She suffered horrible losses of important people in her life, including her husband Percy, her half-sister Fanny by suicide, and many of her children with Percy, as well as other important people in her life. And so this episode does talk about some difficult themes like death and suicide, including Mary Shelley's depression and suicidal thoughts. I completely understand if that's not for you. However, if you're still interested, I do want to emphasize that this episode isn't about that darkness as much as it's about how Mary's story is a story of hope persisting through the darkness, of not giving in to nihilism when it feels like the world is ending. Her story, both her life and The Last Man, is a story that teaches us that instead of giving up, we should reach out to other people. We should continue to give and seek love in its myriad forms, and we should try to rebuild the world together. So, this episode may not be so much about the facts of the recent pandemic, but it is about the feelings that many of us have and are experiencing. And I do believe that engaging with our feelings, processing them together, helps us think more deeply and critically about history, current politics, and what lessons we can draw from our experiences to figure out the challenges we face today. In the very least, I hope that this episode encourages you to turn to hope and to each other rather than giving up. I know that that's how this conversation with Eileen left me feeling, and so I hope you enjoy this conversation with her as much as I did. Thanks so much for joining us today, Eileen.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm so excited to have you back. I loved our first conversation. I always learn so much from you. And I also, the one thing about this conversation is I think it's so fitting that we're doing this close to Halloween, although we'll be probably releasing it in the winter or spring. So, people will have to kind of get back in the spooky season mood for us.
Mary Shelley was the queen of horror after all.
Yeah, exactly. The original goth girlfriend. So I love her for that. So I think to get us started, I kind of want to, the other thing on a more serious note is that this book is very much It's about plague literature. It's very much immersed in the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's something that I think we as a society are still kind of grappling with and remembering and, kind of situating ourselves and understanding our lives and our world in light of what we've experienced the past 4 years. So I kind of wanted to kind of set the scene with that. And so this nice mix of like historical, going back in time, thinking about Mary Shelley, but then also in her very kind of deeply serious life, then also this note of hope that you say. I think when we think about apocalyptic literature, we often think of more, nihilism, pessimism, cynicism. What I love about your book is how much you draw from Mary Shelley, this incredible hope that's born through the struggle with suffering, with tragedy. So I really appreciate the kind of depth of conversation we're going to have today.
Thank you.
So yeah, I wondered if you could kind of start us off a little bit with kind of your sense of Mary Shelley's approach to plague metaphors and kind of why this is such a striking, her work on The Last Man is such a striking way of getting us into the thinking about COVID-19 and also kind of post-apocalyptic visions more generally.
Yes. The way I entered this project of studying Mary Shelley's The Last Man, her 1826 post-apocalyptic pandemic novel, was in many ways through the lens of COVID-19. I had already written and published my book, Artificial Life After Frankenstein, by the time COVID arrived. And in Artificial Life After Frankenstein, I treated Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's first novel from 1818, alongside The Last Man, treating them as two threshold texts for the development of what I call modern political science fiction. And in Artificial Life After Frankenstein, I did emphasize that The Last Man can and should be read as the first major modern post-apocalyptic pandemic novel, really the origin of so much of what we now interpret as post-apocalyptic literature, whether we're thinking about some of the works of Edgar Allan Poe, or we're thinking about the horror movies of the 1950s and 1960s based on Richard Matheson's I Am Legend. We can see traces of Mary Shelley's The Last Man running through post-apocalyptic literature and film to the present. So when COVID-19 happened, I saw the ways in which our society in general was grappling with the themes of her novel in this almost uncanny way. One thing I remember vividly from February, March 2020 is multiple reports in newspapers as well as on social media of people turning to journals as a resource for dealing with the existential angst of living through a pandemic. And that was even before lockdown began. I was very curious to read this because Mary Shelley's novel, The Last Man, is based on the premise that you are reading the plague journal of the sole seeming survivor of a global pandemic in the year 2100. And so in late 2020, I began to write an op-ed. It was eventually published in the New York Times in March of that year, around the time that the WHO declared the pandemic. And one thing I argued in the op-ed was that even when things feel the bleakest, Mary Shelley shows us how we must ethically and politically maintain and retain hope in the face of a massive human exacerbated disaster such as COVID. And I still feel strongly that this novel, although it might appear as though it is a bleak, nihilistic tale about human extinction, is actually not that at all. But you have to read the whole novel, and you have to read it all the way to the end and think about what Mary Shelley is doing with the story in order to appreciate the message in a bottle, as it were, at the end of the story, which is that it does not seem as though the last man really is the last person, for you are reading his testament of survival. And so the clever conceit at the heart of Mary Shelley's The Last Man is that you are the survivor. You are the survivor. You are the reader of the last man's diary of enduring plague seemingly alone. And if you're reading it, that means humanity didn't die out and doesn't have to die out in the future, that there's always a way out of even the most seemingly apocalyptic disasters.
Great. Yeah. No, I love that message. And it's interesting because it's something that, and we can get to later in the conversation. It's also a kind of framing that you play with in your book as well, and that you see in other science fiction too. I was thinking a lot about Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale and the sort of framing with that, more like kind of an archival research look back at and trying to, also kind of deconstruct what exactly is going on in the text that is what you have just read. So yeah. But before we get that, I want to pick up on something that really struck me and kind of what was unique about Mary Shelley and what you're emphasizing in the book is the idea of plagues or pandemics as not just about nature, not just like naturalizing them, but to be products of or shaped by human decisions as well. I think there's a line that the way that you put it is the idea that they are symptoms of deeper human conflict, not just causes of them. And I was wondering if you could kind of give us a little bit more of a story about that.
Yes, thank you. I think when I began this project effectively in February 2020, reading the novel quite literally as a pandemic novel, but one at the same time uses plague as a metaphor. So The Last Man is at once a treatment of plague, quite literally, as a lethal contagious disease that could, in theory, overwhelm the entire human species. And at the same time, it treats plague as a metaphor for human hardship, for tragedy, especially concatenations of human tragedies that gain momentum over time through multiple bad decisions by collectivities of people. One thing that I noticed as I began to read the novel through this double-sided understanding of plague as both a disease and a metaphor for human hardship, human-made hardship, is that Mary Shelley ultimately does not treat the plague as the bad guy, as it were, in the novel. The plague is a product of human wrongdoing. The plague is not in itself the monster, as it were, that's causing the tragedy of the threat of human extinction. Human beings are bringing about their own extinction by entering into interpersonal conflicts, betrayals, wars, and ultimately bringing the downfall of the people around them, the people they love, quite tragically. And so Mary Shelley, in her novel, has at the core of the novel a group of characters who begin in this relatively idyllic setting in the court circle of Windsor Castle in the late 21st century. They seem to be living charmed existences, and they're all living a sort of romance, as it were. But very quickly we see how because of the bad decisions they make with respect to their interpersonal relationships, especially their romantic relationships, they contribute to a international war that starts between Greece and Turkey. And then that war stirs up and spurs the spread of a seasonal plague that historically hit Constantinople. And that plague spreads across borders and becomes the lethal pandemic that then triggers all sorts of other ways in which the lead characters and other people in the novel contribute to this escalation of human conflict, violence, corruption that leads, it seems, everyone to die except the titular last man, the narrator, Lionel Verney, who, interestingly, in this Romana Clef, this autobiographically inspired novel based on Mary Shelley's own journals and own life and her own terrible concatenation of tragedies in her personal and familial life, we have this one seeming survivor left, Lionel Verney, who in effect stands for the author, Mary Shelley.
No, I love that. You gave us a nice kind of walk through the novel, which is really helpful because I have not read it, so I'll have to, hopefully that'll help shape this conversation because we won't be assuming anything about it. You don't necessarily need to have read the book to enjoy our conversation that we're going to have, and I think also and to enjoy your work as well, because I think it's so incredibly complex, the way that you've been able to trace the novel, like you said, to her own personal experiences, that the narrator is a stand-in for Shelley, who saw herself, as you discuss, as this kind of last woman of the kind of second generation of romantic poets. So I guess I wondered if actually maybe we could take a step into that, and could you give us a little bit more stage setting for her relationships with Percy Shelley and Lord Byron, and kind of what was that kind of charmed life that they were living, but then also kind of moving us into the influences of this book and in terms of the tragedies that she then experienced.
Well, Mary Shelley's life is, in some ways, is quite well known because she was the teenage author of Frankenstein. So there are some biographical facts about Mary Shelley I think a lot of people are familiar with, even if they have not read Frankenstein or The Last Man. They probably know that she was a teenage mother at the time that she wrote Frankenstein, that she began to write Frankenstein in 1816, in the summer of 1816, which was known as the year without a summer in Europe. This was the summer that volcanic ash from a volcanic eruption in Indonesia finally swept over Europe and North America, causing all sorts of climate change catastrophes, including just endless rain and cold and even snow in Europe in the summer of 1816. So the story goes that because Mary Shelley was visiting her friend, or relatively new friend, Lord Byron, in Geneva in June of 1816 with her then lover, Percy Shelley, who was at that time married to another woman, another young woman, just a few years older than Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley in 1816, she was 19 years old, and she had eloped with Percy Shelley in 1814 when she was only 16, going on 17. So she must have been 18, going on 19, when she began to write Frankenstein, that dark, rainy summer in Geneva. And so with Percy and Lord Byron and Byron's doctor, John Polidori, who goes on to write the first modern vampire story in English, they entered into a ghost story competition and to entertain themselves, as it was probably too dark and stormy to spend much time outside. And so initially, Mary Shelley famously has a hard time thinking of a story, and she listens to the others tell their ghost stories, and she has some shade to throw about them in her 1831 introduction to Frankenstein. Clearly thinks she came up with the best story, and that was Frankenstein, which was published in 1818. She was born in 1797, and so yeah, she had just turned 20 when Frankenstein was published. And so we tend to know that story about Mary Shelley. What we might not know, beyond the fact that she was a teenage mother, that she was in a relationship with Percy Shelley, but it wasn't official yet because he was still married and had children with another woman. We may not know that a whole host of tragedies befell the house of Mary Shelley as a result of really her decision to elope with Percy when she was only 16 in 1814, the summer of 1814. And beginning with that fateful decision to run away to France with a married radical Republican poet and anarchist who had a history of dating women much younger than him and abandoning those women. Mary Shelley then saw a whole chain of misfortune fall upon her and her family. And in the book, I call this contagions of misfortune. The idea that sometimes one bad choice leads to a whole concatenation of misfortune or wrongdoing. And so, and I think this is the idea at the core of her novel, The Last Man, which she rooted in her own journals that she began the year she eloped with Percy. At first, those journals were co-kept with Percy, but after Percy's death in a drowning accident in July 1822, she took a break from journaling for 3 months. She was utterly devastated by his death. No matter how complicated their marriage was and their family life was, she loved him. And 3 months later, after his death, she opened up a blank journal book. She gave it the title, The Journal of Sorrow. And in the poetic inscription to that journal book, she said, "My life could not end too soon, but for my child." At that point, she had one sole surviving child. She was a widow in her early 20s, and she had one sole surviving child. 3 of the children she bore Percy had died. And she had a miscarriage that almost killed her just a few months before he died. And she would have died had not Percy fetched ice from a nearby town in their village in Italy to stop the bleeding from this traumatic miscarriage. So in their relationship, they saw an almost unthinkable amount of child death. And on top of it, there was suicide. So in 1816, so the very year Mary Shelley starts to write Frankenstein, her half sister, Fanny Imlay Godwin, commits suicide. And it is suggested in the family papers that she commits suicide because she was in love with Percy Shelley and felt rejected by him. Because when Percy eloped with Mary in 1814, he also took with them Mary's and Fanny's stepsister, Claire Claremont, who was 16 years old, like Mary. So he took 2 of the sisters with him, implicitly eloping with both in a polyamorous relationship. And on top of it, he leaves behind the older sister who he initially flirted with. And then 2 years later, Fanny commits suicide. And the family story recorded in manuscripts is that everyone thought it was because she was in love with Percy and felt rejected. And not only rejected by him, rejected by Mary and Claire. And then on top of it, Percy's first wife, Harriet Westbrook, a very young woman, kills herself, drowns herself while pregnant in the Serpentine River in London that winter as well. So there's an almost unthinkable chain of tragedy in the family alone. And it's this chain or concatenation of tragedy, this contagion of misfortune that Mary Shelley records in her journals, especially the Journal of Sorrow. And it is the Journal of Sorrow that I believe Mary Shelley effectively allegorizes in her roman Clef, The Last Man.
No, it's so striking and sad, everything that she experienced. And I was really moved by reading your book in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different places. But I was also moved by specifically that. So, like you said, so she has this journal. You can see The Last Man as being inspired to some degree, her personal writings. And then also kind of, you can't really separate out the personal and the intellectual here, because you also show how I think throughout this time, and you do a lot of careful archival work to bear this out, which is that she was translating Sophocles, I believe, and the Oedipus myth and working on other Greek sources and those probably influence The Last Man as well. And so I would love if you would be willing to kind of give us a little bit of a just brief view of both kind of the Oedipal myth and how it shaped Shelley, and how she, to the extent to which she kind of related to the form of tragedy and contagion, and this sort of family tragedy, interconnected, woven kind of personal responsibility, the sense of personal responsibility, in this sort of broader kind of metaphorical plague. And I guess in Oedipus, I guess there is an actual plague.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, so quite interestingly, Mary Shelley, soon after she eloped with Percy in 1814, began to study ancient Greek under his tutelage. He also taught her stepsister Claire. And one of the earliest records of her work in Greek translation is embedded in the back of her first journal book, which she co-kept with Percy. And that is a quote from Aeschylus's Seven Against Thebes that has to do with Oedipus and the tragedy of Oedipus, the woe of Oedipus. And she modifies a lament in Seven Against Thebes to reflect her own sorrow and her own woe as the wife of, the would-be wife of Percy Shelley, at the same time that Percy is probably having an affair with her stepsister. And also that first year of their elopement, Mary Shelley was pregnant and then prematurely delivered a baby that then died 2 weeks later. And so already just in the first year of her relationship with Percy, Mary Shelley suffers two really grievous tragedies. One is the probable affair of Percy with her stepsister at the same time that she is pregnant, and then loses the baby soon thereafter. I think Mary Shelley began to channel some of this grief and anger into her study of the Oedipus myth. And so her fascination with Oedipus remains throughout her writings, and I record that in my study. But it comes out most strongly, I think, in The Last Man. By that point, she had done a word-by-word translation of the entire play Oedipus Rex. We have that manuscript in the Bodleian Library, and I was able to study that intensively, both there and through digital scans before libraries reopened during the pandemic. And so Mary Shelley's translation of Oedipus Rex is super interesting for a lot of reasons. One is that she designed it, I think, as a reading guide, where she effectively translated every word so that she could have the ancient Greek out in front of her and then effectively be able to kind of double check her own knowledge of Greek by looking at her own translation, where she had every word translated into English in her own hand. But clearly her intention was to not create a new narrative translation of the entire play, but to be able to read it in ancient Greek easily. Like, she wanted to engage with the original. And she also wanted to know the meaning of these words in ancient Greek. And there are certain words she translates that relate to the ideas and concepts of her own plague tragedy, which is The Last Man. She and I do some of that linguistic analysis in the book. One concept she's interested in is blight, which is an image that comes up a lot in Oedipus Rex, especially in the early part of the play. But the only narrative translation she did was just the very first pages of the play, and she focused on the imagery of plague. And of course, in Sophocles' tragedy, there's this image of plague as besetting the city in kind of bloody waves. And so it's at that moment of the play that Mary Shelley ceases to do a narrative translation and moves to the word by word. And I think the reason she switched modes of translation is she'd found the imagery she wanted. We wanted this imagery, this poetic imagery of plague as kind of a wave of tragedy, as it were, that sets a whole community. Plague can't be isolated as a disease that is endemic to, say, one individual, or there can be a soul pollutant, as it were. And one thing that emerges from Mary Shelley's obsession with Oedipus over the course of her adult life is her interest in the question of collective responsibility for wrongdoing. So Oedipus certainly is at least partly responsible for the tragedies that beset him and his entire community, for sure. But is he wholly responsible? No. And Mary Shelley is very interested in as I think, an ethicist and a political theorist. She was the daughter of political philosophers, Wollstonecraft and Godwin. She was deeply read in the tradition of political philosophy. She's interested in using the story of Oedipus as a resource for imagery, but also as a resource for thinking through this fundamental philosophical political problem, which is, how do we determine responsibility? To what extent are any one of us wholly responsible for anything? And how do we sketch out an account of what it means to be collectively responsible for wrongdoing? And on top of that, what do we do? Once we have determined collective responsibility, how do we change things for the better? How do we remedy the problems and wrongs we have brought into the world?
No, and I think that's so. If people are often, when people are familiar with the Oedipal myth, it'll be through Freud, Sigmund Freud. And what I think is interesting, and you do more of a thorough comparison of Mary Shelley and Freud's kind of reception of Oedipus, but it is striking. So basically, the short. I don't know if in case we didn't say it already, but the kind of short, more Freudian emphasis of the myth is that Oedipus, he's originally exposed by his parents as a child, as a baby, because of this prophecy. I forget exactly actually what the prophecy will be, but it's dangerous. Probably, I guess it is essentially what ends up happening, which is that he then, though, finds his way back to the city and ends up murdering his own father and sleeping with his own mother, not realizing that's what he's doing. And I think that that's what essentially the prophecy had predicted. And it is that kind of incest taboo, the flaunting of the incest taboo and parricide that is what causes a plague through the city. And the sort of longer history of tragedy in the family. And so with kind of the view of Mary Shelley's life, you could see how that would be, how it might resonate with her. And I think, but what you just pointed out here with Mary's approach and her interest in blight and these bloody waves, and then also her approach to Oedipus was more of this idea of collective responsibility and the sort of relationality of responsibility in our lives with each other. Whereas the Freudian kind of use of the term is to talk about sexuality, and it is as heavily individualized, as much as it's also generalized as a sort of universal, meant to be a universal psychological insight about desire, which is, I think, such a strikingly different way of like receiving that myth and building out something from it.
Yes. In my book, The First Last Man, I do briefly compare and contrast Shelley and Freud on their reception of Oedipus. There are some really important similarities, which I think are important to point out. One is they're both receiving the Oedipal story in the 19th century in a particular intellectual context, overlapping intellectual context. Both were deeply read in philosophy and obviously in classical literature. Both translated Oedipus at very young ages. And Oedipus leaves a mark on their work throughout their adult lives. But there, I think the similarities and the differences are much more important. The main difference, I think, in the end, is that whereas Freud obviously is the greatest theorist, the original theorist of the human unconscious, and he uses the Oedipal legend to quite intriguingly map out what cannot be understood. I mean, to give us use myth as a tool or a lens to try and understand something that's completely subterranean in our minds. interested in the unconscious. Mary Shelley, like her mother, Wollstonecraft, deeply interested in the question of human responsibility, also human intentionality, human free will, and responsibility for one's choices, good and bad, both deeply influenced by the poet John Milton, especially his epic poem Paradise Lost, which is effectively a theodicy justifying the ways of God to man, also trying to explain the problem of evil, trying to explain how it is that God let evil into the world in the first place through human choice. But like Milton, Wollstonecraft, and her daughter, Mary Shelley, ultimately are interested in the ways human beings intentionally do wrong, intentionally and consciously do evil. And that as a result, we have a collective responsibility for the wrongdoings that come into the world and snowball over time into bigger, more massive disasters. Mary Shelley's take on Oedipus, I think, is really quite interesting. In The Last Man, the narrator, the self-titled Last Man, Lionel Verney, is a stand-in for Mary Shelley herself. It's a roman à clef where the major characters all stand for major people in Mary Shelley's own life. But Verney's the character in the novel that identifies explicitly with Oedipus over and over again, with direct references to various plays by Sophocles, including Oedipus Rex and Oedipus at Calamus. And the way that Verney identifies with Oedipus is not really a Freudian way. It's not about underlying unconscious conflicts. It's very much about him being conscious of the conflicts he brought into his interpersonal relationships over time that contributed to the rise of the global plague, and therefore, ironically, tragically, brought down all the people around him that he knew and loved. So at the end of the day, the tragedy of Lionel Verney is that he contributed to the deaths of everybody around him. And it's his realization of that, his conscious realization of that at the end of the novel, that is both the heart of the tragedy and the path to his redemption. Because it is this awareness that he reaches through writing his own history of the last man that leads him to a path forward. And that leads us to the hopeful ending. The hopeful ending is at the end, Verney does not give up. Verney takes himself to task. He gives us his public confession of everything he did wrong that contributed to the tragedy of the plague and all its death and destruction. But he doesn't sink into nihilism. He instead realizes that he has an obligation to try and find other survivors. Even if they're not out there, it's the right thing to do, to go out in search of other survivors. That quest to find community again, to perhaps find love again, to find partnership again, and to make life anew on the planet in a new, more humane way, and to avoid the conflicts and the tragedies that brought us to this near extinction event would be the beginning of a new form of justice on the planet. And in this way, I think Mary Shelley was paying homage to both of her parents, Wollstonecraft and Godwin, who were both Enlightenment philosophers deeply interested in ideas of cosmopolitan justice or global justice. But Mary Shelley didn't completely agree with either of their visions of what it would take to realize that sort of cosmopolitan justice. And I read the ending of The Last Man as Mary Shelley pointing toward an idea of cosmopolitan justice that is ultimately rooted in conscious recognition of our responsibility for the wrongdoings and injustices and even tragedies of the past, but then using that as a stepping stone for resolving to move forward in a new, more humane and compassionate way towards the world itself, and embracing that collective responsibility, but in a positive sense that would seek to eliminate wrongdoing and injustice as much as is possible, and to embrace love, hope, and charity in its place.
No, that's so beautiful. And I can see in this wonderful kind of summary you gave us of Verney and this more hopeful ending. And I think it's so refreshing to think about collective responsibility in this way, because I think sometimes when people are hesitant to think about kind of complicity. I think there's maybe a fear of kind of self-flagellation, and we associate responsibility so much with blame and punishment that then it makes it harder for people to face up to their own mistakes, I think, to some degree, insofar as it's about, but because you need to, if you're too afraid of punishment, then you won't face up to your own responsibility. And if you don't face up to your own responsibility, then you can't make things better or do better in the future, even if there's something too late. So what comes to my mind and what you were explaining was also parts of your book where you're talking about Mary Shelley's journals, and you're talking about, I think it's the Journal of Sorrow, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. And this is sort of, I think, also kind of your interpretation of Shelley and her life, and also you're kind of bringing to it something that I think that Shelley maybe wasn't necessarily aware of, but the idea that Percy's first wife kind of compared him to a vampire. And it just strikes me, this idea of Mary in her grief also coming to terms with her own sense of responsibility for her half-sister's passing, and as well as maybe to some degree this acknowledgement or an awareness of her effects on Percy's first wife, and Percy's effects on Percy's first wife. And it's this sort of, I don't think it's necessarily villainizing him as much as complicating the vision she had of him, and also kind of dealing with whatever feelings she had of the pain that he caused her and their relationship, and his relationship with Claire, her stepsister. And then also maybe that idea of complicity, of suffering and complicity in the suffering of others, without necessarily, her turning to suicide and punishing herself for it, but instead to try to create a hope, try to create a path forward for herself.
That's right. Yes. It was actually much later than her Journal of Sorrow that she started to, I think, really deal with the death of Harriet. I think her guilt over Harriet's death, Percy Shelley's first wife's suicide, was definitely an animating force in much of her grief writing, including in the Journal of Sorrow. But it's not until her fifth and final of her volume of her journals, which are very understated and quite plain in comparison to some of her earlier journal volumes, especially the Journal of Sorrow, which is highly emotional, and understandably so. But in her final journal book, she's in her 30s, and there's a kind of maturity and wisdom that's evolved in her personal writing. And like the Journal of Sorrow, it's wholly private because Percy's gone. And so she's not co-keeping her journal with anyone. So she doesn't have to code it.
I was gonna ask about the coding too, because I found that so interesting.
Early volumes, she sometimes used to code, or there was obvious self-censorship. In the Journal of Sorrow and the fifth journal book, the journal is all hers. And so in a way, I think we can learn a lot more about Mary Shelley by paying attention to those journal volumes. But it's in the fifth volume, when she's in her 30s, she finally kind of confesses to herself. She puts it in writing that, she felt this terrible, terrible grief over Harriet's death, and it had really haunted her. Now, I do think we can see traces of the ghost of Harriet Westbrook in especially The Last Man, because suicide is a theme of The Last Man. Mary Shelley, in her Journal of Sorrow, as I mentioned earlier, she begins with a poetic inscription which suggests that she herself was on the brink of suicide, if not for the life of her son, that she would rather be dead. And throughout the Journal of Sorrow, she actively contemplates and resists suicide. So Mary Shelley herself was suicidal in the first few years after Percy's death. And I think she wrote The Last Man as a kind of therapy, a kind of self-therapy to pull herself out of that nearly deadly depression. And in The Last Man itself, she has several of the contagions of misfortune that drive the plot revolve around suicide. And there's one I think particularly tragic moment in the story where I think Verney is acting in this self-consciously Oedipal way, where he's aware of the depth of his wrongdoing, at least in retrospect, as he writes his own history of how he came to be the seeming last man on earth. But he recalls how his sister, Perdita, commits suicide after the death of her husband, who stands for Lord Byron, Lord Raymond. The reason Perdita commits suicide, if you read the account carefully, it's a very subtle novel. So when folks read it, I encourage you to take your time, because Mary Shelley puts in so many little details that you might miss it if you weren't reading carefully. But if you read this passage, this section of the book carefully, where we see why it is that Perdita commits suicide by throwing herself off a ship. She commits suicide because her brother has misled her, has lied to her. She wanted to be buried in Greece, where her husband was buried, and Bernie does not want to let her do that. So when she discovers that he has arranged for the ship to leave Greece, and she wanted to basically stay in Greece and die there so that she could be buried there with her husband. And instead, Verney effectively brings on her death, brings on her suicide, because she, in despair, throws herself into the sea, tied to the ship, so that in a, I suppose, a kind of rage at her brother for betraying her and her most personal wishes about how she lives and dies. And so it's moments like that where I see the character of Verney as a vehicle for Mary Shelley's own grappling with her own chain of wrongdoing that led to various tragedies in her family and friend circles, and her contribution to that contagion of misfortune, and also her ethical grappling with it, her recognition of it, at least in retrospect. And I think this is what happens with Harriet Westbrook. She eventually records in her journal, her private journal book, her sense that she was at least partly responsible for what happened to Harriet.
What I also love, and this is, I think, a common theme throughout your work, but this idea of kind of, these are all, for Mary Shelley, such deeply personal tragedies and personal reflections. And yet, and the novel itself has sort of personal dramas, but it's still extremely relevant to and resonant with, and both inspired by, and I think has something to say about kind of global politics, about, as you put it in this book, has a insights for a literary approach to IR, and what we get from thinking about international relations, global politics, global justice through the works of this narrative work, that she herself was, as you said, shaped by her parents, who were philosophers, but developed her own kind of approach to those questions. She wasn't just deferring to them. And in fact, I think kind of throughout the book, she is influenced by Voltaire and Rousseau, who were at odds with each other in their own time. And so this idea that you can kind of take these kind of conflicting or disagreeing or different ideas and approaches and still kind of develop your own kind of approach. I wonder if you could maybe speak to kind of what does The Last Man as a novel have to say about global justice, about global politics?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I think in the end, The Last Man is deeply interested in international relations, but it's as interested in interpersonal relations. So I think what Mary Shelley does to synthesize some of the ideas of her parents is to draw attention to the connections between our interpersonal relationships and conflicts and our international relations and conflicts. And so we can't really separate out what's going on the personal and familial level from what's going on in the political and international level. And in this way, she draws on her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote many autobiographical works that were also at the same time political theoretical works that dealt with questions of equal human rights and cosmopolitan justice. But she is not as focused on the question of rights as her mother, although there are some interesting allusions to the concept of rights in The Last Man. There's a use of the term the rights of womanhood. which is a definite allusion to her mother's Vindication of the Rights of Women from 1792. But she's not as interested in the concept of rights as Wollstonecraft. She's more interested, I think, in relationships. So, end of the day, I mean, we could put her in the camp of what today in philosophy we call, relational ethicists, interested in theorizing human relationships as the basis of ethics itself. And then we can pan out and apply the lessons we learn within interpersonal relationships to the international sphere or to domestic politics. Mary Shelley was also deeply interested in her father's work, Godwin, some Inquiry Concerning Political Justice from 1793 is a great anarchist text defending an ultra-minimal state. But Godwin was also deeply influenced by, surprisingly, Edmund Burke, and was quite interested in Burke's idea of the little platoon, the idea that our attachment to the subdivisions of society is what gives us our identities, gives us our sense of relationships to others, and our sense of moral duties to others. And also, interestingly, Godwin was much more interested in duty than in rights. I personally think that's also something Wollstonecraft shared. But at the end of the day, Wollstonecraft is famous for writing a treatise on the rights of women. And so I think Mary Shelley saw in her father a lot of value, and his interest in Burke, especially Burke's conception of small communities or little platoons being the basis of human relationships and human practice or conception of duty to one another, and therefore the basis of justice. She saw a lot of value in that. And in The Last Man, she has multiple references and even footnotes to the works of Edmund Burke. She clearly had a collection of Edmund Burke's works out while she was writing The Last Man. And at the same time, she was very skeptical of her father's ultra-minimal state idea, which was quite fuzzy and hazy, hard to interpret. How is this actually going to work in real life? Very abstract, utopian idea of an ultra-minimal state. Not a lot of detail, not a lot of practical insight into how this would actually happen or whether it would really realize justice. And so I read The Last Man as in some ways satirizing a lot of Godwin's Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, especially the notion that if we just strip down the state to the basics, we'd be better off. Because what happens in the novel, especially over the course of volume 2 and volume 3, when the war between Greece and Turkey and Constantinople starts spreading this pandemic all over the earth, what you see is that governments are ill-equipped to handle the plague, and societies start tumbling overnight. and uh, and even when smaller groups or smaller little platoons rise up to try and maintain order and justice and a sense of civility towards one another, a sense of ethical duty to help one's fellow man, things still fall apart. And I think this is Mary Shelley's great critique of her father's ultra minimal ideal. Human beings need more structure than that, Mary Shelley thinks. And ultimately, more importantly, human beings need relationships. So if everything was stripped down to its ultra minimum, I mean, the logical extreme of that is one person. And would you really want to be that one person left in that ultra, ultra, ultra minimal state? Do you want to be the one sovereign in the world? No, you do not. You want to ultimately go out and find other people so you can build relationships again and figure out how to do it right the next time. So the ending of The Last Man, I think, is very much a refutation of Godwin. But it's at the same time homage to Godwin and Wollstonecraft in that it envisions the need for some sort of cosmopolitan justice rooted in the best that humanity offers, which is love, charity, a sense of obligation and duty to others, and a desire to try and make the world new, even when it seems as though the lights are going out.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. And it's very well said, as everything that you tend to share with us is. And what I love especially though is that cosmopolitan approach. I wish I could remember because you just put it so well. But it's essentially this idea that it takes this kind of cosmic perspective. And instead of, though, of like becoming overwhelmed or nihilistic or, oh, everything's so much bigger than me, therefore I should just focus on my own little thing. Like I can only control what I can control in my own life. There is this, like, because of this kind of cosmic view of your own experience, and this is to get back to, because I think you're saying you reflect on this in relation to Mary Shelley's experience of suffering, and this idea of empathizing with the suffering of others as a way of kind of recognizing that you can't, your suffering is maybe so little in the grand scheme of cosmic suffering, of the suffering that is happening elsewhere. And that, again, that doesn't necessarily invalidate it or push you to be on your own, but it's instead to say, oh, but pulls us towards each other. It gets us out of ourselves into our community and into our relationships with each other. And that is both the way helping other people is a way of helping ourselves. And there's this kind of interconnectivity to it rather than a kind of abstraction, let's say. There's this embodiment, this kind of connection rather than something more theoretical or removed or distant.
And I think Mary Shelley represents this beautifully in the act of writing her Journal of Sorrow, and then making her Journal of Sorrow the basis of her allegorical plague novel, which is ultimately about the quest for global justice, a sense of cosmopolitan connection to other life forms on the planet. And in the act of sitting down and writing that journal when she was literally on the edge of suicide, that was such a tremendously courageous act on her part. And I think utterly selfless, because if she gave in to her most selfish desires at that moment, Mary Shelley would not have written a single thing. And she didn't. I think, by choosing to write the Journal of Sorrow, she chose life first and foremost, not just for herself, but for others, for her son. But then ultimately, she starts thinking about bigger questions of global responsibility, and that she has an obligation to life itself. And I think her argument in The Last Man is a very long and complex one, but worthwhile to read and to ponder and to imbibe over time, is that we all have this deeper obligation to life itself, not just human life, but to life on the planet. Although one thing I will add, there is at least one reference or allusion to aliens in The Last Man. So, like Immanuel Kant in the late 18th century, Mary Shelley, as a philosopher, is aware of the possibility of life on other planets, and there's at least one allusion to non-human intelligent life forms. And of course, in the Christian tradition, that could also be angels. But still, she has this awareness that life is not solely human life. Life is all life, and non-human life forms matter too. And that's one reason why The Last Man can be read as an allegory for environmental justice as well.
Oh, interesting. That is so fascinating. And yeah, no, I mean, aliens, you got me. This book has it all. I mean, I love that this was a very dark, obviously with Mary Shelley's, all these tragedies, it's a very dark conversation that we're having. And I was thinking, I guess we might need to frame the episode with a little bit of that acknowledgement. But then there is also, we really did talk about vampires, ghosts, and aliens, Frankenstein's monster. I mean, the classic spooky season figures. So I love that.
I mean, Halloween framing all the way.
Yeah. But to get back to, I just wanted to kind of, just because if I don't say it now, and if we don't keep it in the episode, I'll probably have to include it in my little reflections. I just really love, and I can't remember now the letter that Mary Shelley is writing this in, but she says, I definitely typed this out because I was like, oh, what is the use of Republican principles and liberty if peace is not the offspring? War, not kings, is I actually don't know how to pronounce this. Flu. Yeah. War, not kings is the flu of the world. And I just found that so, because I think, she's talking about Republican principles and liberty, but then it's also like, I think the idea of abstraction, of like theory, and this idea of what this cruelty of when, lofty principles become not enough, or maybe potentially the cause of physical, deep, even existential, one might say, suffering of other people, right? I mean, that's, I guess, is a sort of, there's all sorts of political philosophers who are thinking about this and trying to grapple with that idea of the cause being, a commitment to a cause sometimes being a violation of responsibility to others. But I just think there's something so striking that she was reflecting in that way. And I think it speaks to what you were just describing in terms of her kind of approach to global justice.
Yeah, it's an amazing line. I believe it's from a letter from the early 1830s, so it's after The Last Man, but I think it allows us to see the ways in which she always saw the plague as a political force, a politically driven force, not a purely natural evil, but something exacerbated and produced by human conflict. So, as you put it earlier, as a symptom of a deeper human disease, which is the propensity towards conflict and war. So, war is the real evil, whether that's happening at interpersonal level or an international level. And in this way, she agreed with Percy Shelley, who was an extremely strong pacifist. On the other hand, she has a subtle dig at Percy because Percy was also a very strong Republican, and she says war not kings is the flu of the world. And so, Mary Shelley may have had some monarchist sympathies that come out in The Last Man a bit, when she sets volume one entirely in the court of Windsor Castle. Uh, and she obviously had a strong Burkean side too. So that's another interesting way to read Mary Shelley, is navigating a really interesting middle position between pacifism, republicanism, which she obviously agreed with. She thought republicanism was the future, but she's also like, wait a second, but are kings really the problem here?
Well, exactly. And I was also thinking about Lord Byron's death and her being impacted by his death. And to some degree, that kind of fight for kind of independence, Greek independence. And I guess not that that wasn't a worthwhile fight, but I don't know if did that shape her thinking on that.
For sure. I mean, she was a huge Philhellene. She was a huge supporter of Greek independence, all the struggles for independence in Southern Europe at the time. But she didn't think, war itself was always a bad deal for everybody. And she also thought, a lot of the tragedy that beset her family and friends had to do with Percy and Byron's obsession with Greek independence. That they never would have moved to Italy if not for this obsession with the independence movements of Southern Europe of the 1810s. And in The Last Man dramatizes this by having the Lord Byron figure, Lord Raymond, and the Percy figure, Prince Adrian, go fight for Greek independence. And this is the beginning of their interpersonal conflict becoming political. And so she really puts the blame on both of them. And it's pretty clear that she's using the battle between Greece and Turkey as an allegory for the ways in which her social circles, political obsession with Southern independence movements led to their own downfall. And was it worth it? I mean, I think she's saying we should question that. Even if the war itself may seem justified, is war ever really worth it? And so, in that way, I think she's a really principled pacifist thinker. And this is another way in which I think her relational theory of cosmopolitan justice is at base a peaceful one.
No, that's beautiful. Well, you've been so generous with your time, so I hesitate to take up more of it. But I do have one last topic that I wanted to get to because we share these interests, I think, which is that I love the framing, how much you start, especially how much of the beginning of your book is kind of walking the reader through the experience of the archives. And you're also talking about that archival experience during the pandemic, which I didn't get to go to the archives that I was working on during the pandemic in person, but I did rely on the digital archives like you were. And I think what's so striking about this and what you get to in the in the book too is that it's like it is simultaneously being in the archives can be simultaneously a very kind of solitary experience and also extremely kind of connecting. Like you really connect and commune with the text. Also, you might work with other scholars who are giving you feedback. And also, sometimes it's in those moments of solitude that you're actually kind of feeling your relationships more deeply or feeling or being able to kind of again kind of feel that connectivity, whether it's with a text or with people in your life or people who were in your life more deeply. And so I guess I wanted to ask more just like why was it important to you to kind of frame the book in the way, and what is interesting is you're framing it, you bookend it both with the archival reflections and with personal reflections too. So it's not just like the intellectual, it's also quite personal, just like Mary Shelley.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for reading the book so carefully and especially understanding the way the framing works. As a writer, I struggled a lot with how to frame the book. The way I framed it is ultimately the way I thought the book had to be written. There was no other way to do it. In the same way, I believe Mary Shelley thought the only way to write Her Last Man was to root it in her own journal of sorrow. And so I sought to, in some ways, pay homage to Mary Shelley's writing style and approach by rooting my study of The Last Man and her Journal of Sorrow in my first person reflections on not only COVID-19, which is how the book begins with the op ed I published in the New York Times in March 2020 about Mary Shelley's The Last Man and its relevance for what we were going through at that moment. And then I end it with a postface, which is effectively a reflection on my first archival research trip during COVID in June 2021, where I had to spend 5 days in quarantine in a British hotel before I could go to the Bodleian and other libraries to do my research. And I kept a quarantine journal. I kept a pandemic journal, and eventually decided to publish something quite close to that journal as the postface of the book. And yet I decided as well to pay homage to Mary Shelley and including a fictionalized frame, which is inspired not only by Shelley, but some of her greatest inspirations or her greatest intellectual descendants, such as Margaret Atwood. So there's a lightly fictionalized frame as well, where I imagine a scholar 100 years from now finding my pandemic journal and the manuscript for my book. And I hope readers enjoy it. It was very much a literary experiment for me, the blending of history and fiction in the framing of my scholarly book. But I firmly believe it was the only way it could be written. And I wanted it to be something to make the story of Mary Shelley's The Last Man feel fresh and relevant for people today. So it was definitely one of the hardest things I've ever written, but I feel very proud of it, and I hope readers enjoy it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you should be proud, and I think it's wonderful, and I think it's also really refreshing. I think that academic work to reach to all sorts of people, and also I think to some degree, when you're working on literature and political theory, I think there's a sort of freedom to express oneself that you don't necessarily enjoy in other disciplines so much. I mean, we have our own norms, our own expectations and disciplines, but I think the more that people challenge even just those norms are actually a way of, I think, actually allowing the material to be more deeply received by readers. And so I don't think it takes away. I think it can only further strengthen the kind of insights and I think the reflection, I think there's this sort of like being able to understand where an author is coming from, whether it's an author from a couple of centuries ago or somebody writing right now, is I think also a way of connecting with them so that you can also develop your kind of own perspective too. And it reminds you of your own experiences, your own thoughts. And I think that sort of dialogical experience is something that I definitely get through with your work and your writing. So thank you so much for doing that for us. And thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything that we didn't get to talk about or work you're excited about that you wanted to discuss?
Well, right now I'm editing or putting the final touches on an edition of Mary Shelley's Last Man alongside her Journal of Sorrow for Oxford World's Classics. And that will be coming out in January 2026 in time for both of their bicentennials. And so I'm really looking forward to being able to put that out so that general readers can pick up and enjoy not only The Last Man, but The Journal of Sorrow, understand their interconnections, and hopefully we'll see a resurgence of interest in The Last Man across various fields of study, humanities and social sciences.
That sounds incredible. I'm very excited about that. Thanks again. It was really lovely chatting with you as always.
Thank you.
I wanted to end on a few reflections on this conversation with Eileen. In our last episode, we talked to Dr. Ruth Slegers about Freud, and we talked a little bit about Freud here, specifically comparing his approach to the Oedipal myth and Mary Shelley's use and references to the Oedipal myth in her book, The Last Man. I really like how Eileen emphasized that the Freudian approach is very much subterranean, about individual psychology and subconscious desire. But Shelley's reading of the classics of the Oedipal myth was very interested in questions of collective responsibility. Like the Oedipal myth, The Last Man deals with the question of responsibility for a plague. Shelley is interested particularly in how do we determine collective responsibility? Once we have a sense of collective responsibility, then what do we do? Eileen told us that Verney gives a final accounting of his own actions and how he contributed to the plague and takes ownership of his responsibility. As hard as that is, he does not give up, but leaves the story in a bottle that we survivors read and goes out in search of other survivors. In terms of the approach to global politics that Eileen develops out of Mary Shelley's work, she emphasizes how Shelley and her father William Godwin shared an interest in Edmund Burke's notion of little platoons, of seeing our smaller communities as places where our reciprocal commitments to each other are more in terms of duties and can be the basis of justice. At the same time, she argues that The Last Man satirizes Godwin's rather more extreme anarchist rejection of the state. And Shelley suggested that as much as these little communities were important, states were still a key part of how people organized and reacted to global problems like pandemics. Eileen is describing essentially a type of approach to politics that is polycentric, to use a term that is common in our fellowships. And that is that there are multiple centers of power and different levels of institutions at which individuals can affect political change. Additionally, Hunt's reading of Shelley pushes toward pacifism. As much as Shelley was inspired by and engaged in republicanism, self-governance, and self-determination, sympathetic to the Greek War for Independence going on in her time, a sympathy she shared with Percy Shelley and Lord Byron, she also tempered her commitment to Republican principles with awareness of the violence of warfare, trying to navigate her Republican commitments with a commitment to pacifism. This reminded me of early sociologist Max Weber's 1919 lecture, Politics as a Vocation, which we political theorists often analyze, especially when we're talking about political ethics. There he compares an ethic of conviction or ultimate ends with an ethic of responsibility. In short, Weber argued that while it is noble and desirable to engage in politics on behalf of a good cause, there's a real danger in only having one's own conviction as their guiding principle, because one might be tempted to use your ends to justify all sorts of horrific means. But an ethic of responsibility of taking ownership over the consequences of one's political actions, even when they are unintended, and both in terms of taking responsibility of what one does to others as well as what one does to one's own moral character, can help mitigate the destructive dangers that an ethic of ultimate ends might risk. When Weber describes the type of person who can act in such a balanced way, he should suggest someone who can combine passion with a cool sense of proportion. Going a little beyond Weber, I think that such a unique combination also requires a very nuanced approach to our emotions and how they shape moral and political judgment. To return to what Eileen's study of Shelley brings to this puzzle, Shelley developed her political theory in tandem with very deep and emotionally complex reflections on her life, her personal relationships, and her grief, developing these ideas through literature, not simply a essay or treatise. I think that it is in being unafraid of this self-reflection and confronting the difficulties we share in being in community with others that helped her develop quite a nuanced and complex approach. To operationalize the type of approach to political judgment that I'm describing here, I want to give an example of a politician that I think illustrated a unique combination of Weber's ethics of conviction and responsibility, as well as emotional aptitude, and relates to the vision that Eileen develops out of Mary Shelley. Former U.S. Representative Barbara Lee is well known for being the only member of Congress to have voted against the 2001 authorization of use of military force, passed just 3 days following the 9/11 attacks. This particular AMF was extremely broad, allowed the executive branch to launch military campaigns in 22 countries since then, and it is still in use today, despite a lot of critique from people from all sides of the political spectrum. In the show notes, we'll share a link to Barbara Lee's speech and a Radiolab podcast, episode 60 Words, which interviews her. Reflecting on those days in the podcast, she talks about what she knew about psychology from her training as a social worker, and especially the importance of not making decisions when feeling fearful. She talks about wrestling over whether to go along with the rest of Congress and unify behind the president. And finally, when she makes the decision to not vote for the authorization, she explains that she was moved by the words of the Reverend at the memorial service at the National Cathedral. Reverend Nathan Baxter had said, "Let us pray for divine wisdom, that as we act, we not become the evil we deplore." And so she chose not to cede power to the executive, that to properly embrace and respect the distress that she and others were feeling that day, to respect the grief and mourning and suffering of that time, to be more, not less, cautious about taking violent action. She received a ton of hate mail for her actions, but she won her next election and was continually reelected for years. It's interesting because I think in Lee, we see a person standing up for both principles that Eileen describes finding in Mary Shelley's work. That is, Republican liberty, attempting to stem the further centralization of power in the executive, maintaining checks and balances in the American constitutional system, and not ceding Congress's power and responsibility to wield its power, as well as pacifism, trying to hold off on an imperial violent reaction, which did end up drawing us into the war on terror that continues to this day. I've long admired Lee for her actions, and I often think of her when I teach and write on Weber. And I also think she really relates nicely to Eileen's discussions of Shelley too, of the way that we cannot ignore but must process our grief as a part of our personal and political lives, and as a part of the process of good decision-making. And I think that's a fitting note to end on this pandemic-related episode, and in light of our current political moment as well. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Till next time.